Okay, picture this. Gabor Maté, this super insightful physician, is standing there talking about addiction, not in the way you usually hear it, like bad habits or brain disease or whatever, but as a response to deep, buried pain. He says people aren't addicted because they're weak or broken. They're addicted because they're trying to escape something. Sounds kind of intense, right? But here's where it gets even crazier. Maté goes beyond the typical medical talk and pulls in Chinese medicine. Yeah, that whole idea of life energy, qi, and emotional balance. It sounds mystical at first, but when he starts connecting it to addiction, it hits differently. Imagine that all that pain, that trauma, is messing with the flow of your energy, creating blockages that lead straight to addiction.
Yeah, well, it's Chinese medicine has its roots in nature.
Right.
So it's, based in yin and yang, which is all the opposites in the universe, based in the 5 elements, thousands of years old, from China, obviously. And it was, developed out of people, sages probably sitting around and going, wow, look at the universe, look at everything around us. And so that's where it arose from. The concept of addiction probably wasn't something that was, talked about as addiction, but talked about as an imbalance. And there are emotions that are attached to each element, which is attached to the meridians, and they're attached to the seasons and colors and sounds and all of that. One of the organs that's really connected with the addiction and treating that in Chinese medicine is the liver. So the liver is said to control the smooth flow of qi or energy in the body. And so when emotions get blocked, so when they're not expressed and when things just kind of keep internalizing and internalizing, there's actually a name for this syndrome. It's called liver qi stagnation. And so liver qi stagnation actually physiologically leads to, just like in Western medicine, where our mind controls our emotions, controls our nervous systems and immune systems, that same syndrome exists within Chinese medicine, so that the blockage of energy not moving is what is treated with addictions. Also the heart, anything to do with the mind, including addictions and insomnia, and many different things like that. Depression is treated by treating the heart, because our heart and mind are intrinsically connected together too. What we long for and what we long to see is also what we long to be. And so that just kind of gets turned back in, and that's how we treat in Chinese medicine. It's the process of diagnosis is when I sit down with somebody, I use my background in counseling, I use my background as a paramedic, and then I use Chinese medicine. So I'll talk to a person, of course, find out, what their history is, what's going on, where is your pain, and when did your pain start, and what was your childhood like? And I'll ask them, what do you do to soothe yourself when you have pain? And that's often a clue to things like addiction. And then we just take from there. There's a tongue and pulse diagnosis, which is, we were talking about this on the way here, how tongue diagnosis was something it's kind of a folksy.
Tongue diagnosis. The tongue, Chinese medicine. The tongue is a critical accessory organ of the human body. It helps with tasting, chewing, and swallowing food and drink. It is also an aid to speech. In traditional Chinese medicine, the tongue reflects the health condition of the entire body. Examining the tongue is an essential component of Chinese medicine practice. What is tongue diagnosis? In traditional Chinese medicine, licensed practitioners often examine the tongue to confirm the diagnosis. Due to its many relationships and connections in the body, both to the meridians and the internal organs. For example, a pale tongue could be a sign of blood deficiency. No tongue coating or thick tongue coating are signs of digestive system issues. What can the tongue tell about the body? Chinese medicine focuses on the body of the tongue and the coating of the tongue. The body of the tongue speaks a lot to the flow of qi, energy, in one's body, as well as the quality of one's blood. Typically, the coating of the tongue tells us the strength of the digestive system and pathogens affecting the body. By looking at both the tongue body and its coating, The practitioner can understand the patient's current nutritional state and metabolic state.
Way that even Western doctors would use of diagnosing patients many years ago, not used so much nowadays, but it's a main part of Chinese medicine diagnosis. So anyways, using the listening to a patient, looking at a patient, palpating that radial pulse, and there's 28 different characters in the radial pulse, looking at the tongue, looking at the eyes for something called Shen, which is spirit, and then just treating what's manifesting in the person at the time.
It's very interesting. I've had Chinese medicine diagnosis a couple of times, and each time they take the pulse, and as a Western trained doctor, when I look at the pulse, I'm looking at basically two things. One is what the rate of it is, or three things perhaps: the rate, regularity of it, and the strength of it. Three things. You look at 28 things,
right?
Which is strikes me as a bit more subtle, perhaps, than what I do. But picking on what you said, what's really astonishing about Western medicine is that, let me tell you a story. So I think 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was done in San Francisco. And I was invited to speak there by Kaiser Permanente, which is a large healthcare provider. It's a large healthcare corporation, I guess. There are a group of studies called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies that were done by Kaiser Permanente or in Kaiser Permanente's system in California that have shown that for each experience of childhood adversity, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, death of a parent, a divorce, a child or a parent being mentally ill or addicted, or violence in the family, or a parent being jailed, for each of these.
So where does Maté take it from there? Well, he digs into how, in Chinese medicine, different organs hold different emotions. The liver with anger, the lungs with grief. Trauma and emotional wounds, they block the flow of qi in these organs, trapping people in pain, which drives them to self-medicate. It's like, instead of healing the pain, they use substances to cover it up, temporarily forcing their energy to flow. But Maté's approach is all about getting to the root of that blockage. He's saying, why treat the symptoms when you can heal the deeper wound? He talks about how breaking the cycle of addiction is not just about stopping the behavior, but restoring balance on every level. It's not just physical recovery, it's emotional and spiritual healing too. By blending Western psychology with Chinese medicine, he's offering a way to not just stop addiction, but to truly heal the person underneath. And that's what makes his approach so powerful.
Arthritis goes up, the risk of cancer goes up, the risk of mental illness goes up. I mean, everything bad.
Because the immune system gets attacked too.
Well, it's the immune system amongst other systems. Right. But here's the deal. So I'm going to go and speak to 200 addiction clinicians in the Kaiser Permanente system. These studies, the adverse childhood experience studies, have been published worldwide in major journals, and there's an increasing movement around them. In fact, if you don't know about them, you can look them up online, the ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies, and there's even a daily online ACE journal that you can get these days. Well, you got the picture? Adverse experience studies, significant data to show the relationship between childhood adversity and adult addiction and adult dysfunction in general, done in California in the Kaiser Permanente system. So the organizers, a couple of months before the event where I was going to speak to their clinicians, they asked me, is there some literature you could send us that would support your point of view? I said, yes, surely you've heard about the adverse childhood experiences studies. No, what are those?
Oh.
And it's entirely possible for somebody to go to addiction doctors for years and nobody ever asks them what you asked, which is, tell me about your childhood. That question doesn't come up. Now, that question ought to come up Whether you got psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, or addiction, that's another story. But with addiction and that clear evidence, you know, and the evidence between the showing the impact on brain development of the early relationships, that the question of childhood never comes up in addiction clinics over and over and over again, and it's just all about the behaviors. And they keep repeating the mantra. Another article in the New York Times this week: addiction is a brain disease. Addiction is a biological brain disease. Addiction is a biological brain disease. They've got themselves mesmerized, hypnotized by their very narrow, and what that actually is, it's a self-soothing. The very belief that it's a biological brain disease is a self-soothing behavior.
There you go.
Because it allows us as a society not to look at the pain and the trauma that are experienced by so many people, and it allows the doctors themselves not to look at their own stuff. But you know, unfortunately, it also means that we're limited in what we can do for people.
Well, and psoriasis, you just mentioned psoriasis, and it reminded me that, you know, I spent my teen years from about 13 to, you know, almost 18 on the streets and in and out of foster care and stuff. And I had psoriasis during that time, which that's when it began.
Wow.
And it started my elbows, and went on my arms, it was on my legs, it was on my scalp, it was everywhere. And by the time I was in my mid-30s, it was really bad, and just itchy, scratchy, big scaly things. And gradually over the years, with just awareness and taking care of myself and, you know, letting out a lot of the pain that was inside, it's diminished. And as of 6 months ago, I don't have any. I had the last spot, was one spot on my ankle, and it's finally gone. But it took, you know, what, 40 years for it to go away?
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
according to NIH, the etiology of autoimmune diseases is multifactorial, genetic, environmental, hormonal, and immunological factors are all considered important in their development. Nevertheless, the onset of at least 50% of autoimmune disorders has been attributed to unknown trigger factors. Physical and psychological stress has been implicated in the development of autoimmune disease, since numerous animal and human studies demonstrated the effect of sundry stressors on immune function. Moreover, many retrospective studies found that a high proportion, up to 80% of patients reported uncommon emotional stress before disease onset. Unfortunately, not only does stress cause disease, but the disease itself also causes significant stress in the patients, creating a vicious cycle. Recent reviews discuss the possible role of psychological stress and of the major stress-related hormones in the pathogenesis of autoimmune disease. It is presumed that the stress-triggered neuroendocrine hormones lead to immune dysregulation, which ultimately results in autoimmune disease. By altering or amplifying cytokine production, the treatment of autoimmune disease should thus include stress management and behavioral intervention to prevent stress-related immune imbalance. Different stress reactions should be discussed with autoimmune patients, and obligatory questionnaires about trigger factors should include psychological stress in addition to infection, trauma, and other common triggers.
sure. And when we talk about even the word rash, it has other meanings, right?
It is what?
It has other meanings.
Right.
Rash, when somebody does a rash action or rash behavior, you know?
Yeah.
And what do we call it when the skin, what does the skin do when it breaks out in a rash?
It erupts.
It erupts. And what happens is when the emotions are not allowed to erupt when they need to,
Right.
then the skin will erupt.
Yeah.
It's really that simple.
It is.
Now, there's all kinds of physiological reasons for that, to do with the nervous system, and the hormonal apparatus and the immune system. But of course, what is the mainstay of psoriasis treatment, from your experience, from dermatologists?
Cortisone.
Cortisol cream,
Yeah.
right? And what is cortisol?
It's a stress hormone.
It's a stress hormone. So here's this obvious clue.
Yeah.
that
And it didn't work for me anyways.
Right, and there's other treatments now as well, but we treat so many things with cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and we never ask ourselves, gosh, is it possible that stress might have something to do with this condition?
Right.
You know, and the links are, again, it's one of these links that scientifically are being so clearly established, but they utterly escape medical notice. And when it comes to addiction, of course, to bring it back to addiction, for a lot of, when you ask people, well, let's ask it here. So those who had addictive behaviors, and then you gave it up for a while, and then you had a relapse, what usually happened before the relapse? Some kind of stress. Some kind of stress.
Yeah.
So the addiction also functions as a quick stress reliever.
Yeah.
As a quick stress reliever, because we can't handle those high levels of cortisol. We want to soothe them. So when you infuse animals with cortisol, they're more likely to use cocaine or alcohol to soothe themselves.
Yeah.
So again, when an infant is born, they have no capacity to regulate their stresses. They can't. So if you don't pick up an infant, you feed them and all that, but if you don't pick them up, they're going to die. Because they'll literally stress themselves to death. Now, the capacity to regulate stress, in other words, to have our stress response in reaction to a threat, but then to have that stress response soothe and calm down automatically, that has to develop. So that's a developmental attribute.
Right.
But for that, the conditions have to be right. And when the child was stressed and the parents could not hold the child in that stressful moment and relieve the child's stress, regulate the child's stress, then the child never develops the capacity to regulate stress. And then we turn to addictive substances. So I will give you another quote on that if I can find it.
And then maybe we'll open up for some questions, eh?
Absolutely, yeah. So let me just find this quote. Usually I can find this one pretty quickly, but maybe not tonight.
While you're looking, I just want to say too that, you know, the fact that my psoriasis took all those many years, decades to go away, and that it did go away was amazing to me, because I've been feeling my nervous system healing, and it's taken this amount of time and perspective for it to finally heal to the point where my body caught up with what was going on with my nervous system. It's a miracle to me. And it's a miracle, but it also, it shows me again the hope that we can all heal, that nothing is unredeemable to me, that everything can be healed if we have enough compassion, if we have enough, take enough time, if we have enough insight.
Absolutely, and that concept of the inner healing, that we have an inner healing force within us that needs to be opened and encouraged, that's utterly missing for Western medical practice. It's all about our interventions. So it's the suppression of symptoms or the cutting out or killing of disease.
Right.
But that there's a healing capacity inside people that is much more powerful than we imagine. That never occurs to us. I found this quote, and this is Almas, and he says, pertains to this capacity to regulate stresses. The child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he is with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. The organism does not develop the confidence that it can regulate itself, that things will happen the way they should. The pain and the frustration, if they continue, they will have a disintegrating effect on the organism, and the child will begin to experience organismic fear for its very survival. And then he says, this is the healing part, if we can regain the capacity to spontaneously charge and discharge, in other words, if we can develop that internal capacity to handle when stress happens, have the tension and let go of it, he says. If we can change the rejection pattern when we try and reject our pain, which is what addiction is, and reconnect with our natural confidence and trust. I mean, in other words, confidence and trust, like your confidence. That's a natural quality of human beings, if they're given the right environment. to develop it. But it has to develop. It's like it's there in the infant, but it has to be nurtured. And if it isn't, then we lose the confidence. So he says, if we can change the rejection pattern and reconnect with our natural confidence and trust, we call that self-realization. Mm-hmm. Of course, we can also call that healing.
And resiliency, right? Restoring that elasticity to be able to take things in and also let them go instead of just internalizing and driving it down.
That's right. And after that incident at that dinner a few weeks ago, I'm really grateful for the experience. I'm truly, humbly, and profoundly grateful for the experience, because it taught me something I really needed to learn. But there I was, and having written 4 books full of insight and appreciated by
millions.
I would like to say that, but let's say hundreds of thousands anyway. Okay.
Okay.
Hundreds of thousands for sure. I know that. And having taught and having led seminars, but I couldn't let it out and let it in. I couldn't let it in and let it out.
Yeah.
I couldn't do that. I took it in, and it stayed in, and it felt toxic. And it took me 4 weeks to work through it.
Wow.
Well, I'm really grateful for that experience. I truly feel I've let go of something, but there I was, despite all that awareness, still having to do that. At my retreats, I often play, trite as it may sound, but it isn't. The Beatles had some extraordinarily wise lyrics.
Oh, yeah.
Especially when you consider how young they were and how, in so many ways, screwed up they were. But that song, "Let It Be," let it out and let it out and let it in, let it out and let it in, let it in and let it out. That's what we're talking about.
Well, we forget that we, if we were like had a front door and a back door, we forget that we have a front door and a back door, and we can let things in. Instead of closing it, we can actually let things in, because if we do have the ability, we can let them out. But that's what we forget. We forget that we can.
My wife, when we were having our 3rd child, she gave the experience of, it's like your little house on the prairie, and the prairie wind is just raging at the door. And if you block the doors, it might knock the house down. What you have to do is you have to open the front door.
Wow.
And you have to open the back door.
That's great.
She's talking about labor pains. You have to let the wind come into the front door, let it out through the back door, and then the house will stay standing.
That's great.
Well, and maybe with that, we can turn it over to you folks now. So if you have questions.
Dr. Maté, I want to better understand the role of cortisol, which you brought up recently.
Yeah.
That, there's the circadian quality of cortisol that is, it's part of our normal function.
Yeah.
But when it's dysregulated, I want to understand exactly how that works with stress and how that is connected to addictive behavior.
Cortisol. What it is, function, symptoms and levels. What is cortisol? Cortisol is a glucocorticoid hormone that your adrenal glands produce and release. Hormones are chemicals that coordinate different functions in your body by carrying messages through your blood to your organs, skin, muscles and other tissues. These signals tell your body what to do and when to do it. Cortisol is an essential hormone that affects almost every organ and tissue in your body. It plays many important roles, including regulating your body's stress response, helping control your body's use of fats, proteins and carbohydrates, or your metabolism, suppressing inflammation, regulating blood pressure, regulating blood sugar, helping control your sleep-wake cycle. Is cortisol a stress hormone? Cortisol is widely known as the stress hormone. However, it has many important effects and functions throughout your body aside from regulating your body's stress response. Acute stress. Acute stress happens when you're in sudden danger within a short period of time. For example, barely avoiding a car accident or being chased by an animal are situations that cause acute stress. Chronic stress. Chronic, long-term stress happens when you experience ongoing situations that cause frustration or anxiety. Traumatic stress. Traumatic stress happens when you experience a life-threatening event that induces fear and a feeling of helplessness.
So cortisol is a stress hormone. The word itself comes from the word cortex, and cortex means bark, like the bark of a tree. So the cortex of the brain, the cortex is like the bark, the thin layer that covers the white tissue of the brain, is the gray matter, the cortex. So the adrenal gland, renal means kidney, adrenal means on top of the kidney. So the adrenal gland also has a cortex, a thin rind. And so cortisol is named after the cortex where it comes from. So cortisol comes from the cortex of the adrenal gland. And the other hormone that comes from the adrenal gland, of course, is named after the gland itself. So it's called adrenaline. So you have these two stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. And how that works is that if you perceive a threat, not only if there's a threat, but if you perceive a threat, and the perception could be valid, it could be entirely imaginary, but it doesn't matter. If you perceive a threat through a cascade of influences that begin in the emotional centers of the brain, and through the hypothalamus, which is a master gland in the brain, and then through another gland called the pituitary, and eventually to the adrenal gland, you'll get the release of adrenaline and cortisol. Now, there's certain base levels of adrenaline and cortisol, and then you mentioned there's a daily rhythm to that. But apart from that baseline levels, there are surges of these stress hormones when there's a perception of threat. And the reason for that is that adrenaline will give your muscles more strength, will send your heart pumping more rapidly, so more oxygen is delivered to the tissues of the muscles, so you can fight or escape. And at the same time, the cortisol, amongst other things, elevates blood sugar levels, so again you have more energy for the defensive or flight behaviors that you need to engage in. So that's good. But in the long term, those same stress hormones will damage you. So adrenaline will give you high blood pressure, narrow your blood vessels, increase the risk of heart disease, and so on. Cortisol itself will, in the long term, if it stays elevated, it will cause ulcerations in the intestines, thin your bones so you get osteoporosis, put fat on your belly, more risk of heart disease, make you depressed, suppress the immune system, and also shrink certain key organs in the brain. So think Alzheimer's as a stress-related disorder, actually.
Gabor Maté's message is pretty clear. Addiction isn't the enemy, it's the signal. It's your body and soul crying out for healing, for balance. And the beautiful thing, healing is possible. By looking deeper, by addressing the pain and trauma that caused the blockages in the first place, real change can happen. It's not just about breaking free from addiction, but breaking free from the pain that led you there. Imagine a life where you're no longer stuck in the same cycles, where your mind, body, and emotions are aligned and you're actually living, not just coping. That's the kind of transformation Maté is talking about, and it's within reach. Healing is messy, sure, but it's also incredibly freeing, and you deserve that kind of freedom. Not the world, not what's outside of us, but what we hold inside traps us.